Hello, welcome back to Ling 201, Introduction to Linguistics. I'm your instructor, Brett C. Nelson. Today we'll be starting our discussion of semantics, and specifically the logical part of meaning, that is semantics. The readings for today were from Contemporary Linguistic Analysis, Chapter 6, Sections 0 through 3. And so the announcements for this week, on Thursday, your fifth and final discussion post will be due, having to do with syntax and semantics and how to connect those to everything else in the world. So get those in by Thursday. Then on Friday, I'll be posting quiz 5 to D2L, and this is semantics and pragmatics. So this week's topic and next week's topic, you'll have a week to do that starting on Friday. The readings for next week will be the second half of Chapter 6, Sections 6 through 4, having to do with language and meaning and context, and specifically pragmatics. Before we start today, I'd like to acknowledge that we're here learning in the area where the Bow and Elbow Rivers meet in southern Alberta, a place known in Blackfoot as Mohkinstsis. This is a name now used to refer to the city of Calgary. This land lies within the territory of Treaty 7, which is signed by this land's stewards, representatives of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda. Additionally, this land is home to speakers of Korean Tunaha, as well as members of Métis Nation of Alberta. So I'm a newcomer to this land. I come from Wabancha, the land of many tongues at the mouth of the Mississippi, the Great River. I strive to learn more about the land, its peoples, their languages, and their history every day. Here at the University of Calgary, I hope to contribute to and continue a journey of transformation and renewal in our ways of knowing, doing, connecting, and being, all with a spirit of truth and reconciliation for continued shared enjoyment of this beautiful place. So the plan for today, we'll be discussing basic logic and logical relations. We'll expand those relations to the word level in order to discuss lexical semantics. And then we'll examine how meaning interacts with syntax in verbs and noun phrases. So the first half of today's course today's lesson has to do with logic. And so what is logic? Well, logic, as I define here at the top, is the science of distinction and of true and false, true from false reasoning. And so the meaning of the sentences and language is deeply connected, and how we study the meaning of sentences and language is deeply connected to this concept of logic, specifically with something called a truth value, whether the sentence is proposing, whether what the sentence is proposing is true or not. So you might have enough information to determine a truth value of a sentence. So for these, based on your attendance in this course and viewing these lectures, you should know that Brett C. is the instructor of this course, and that the instructor has one orange cat and one gray cat. Or you might not have enough information to determine a truth value. Brett C. has 2 dogs. But you do know that it does have a truth value. It either is true or it isn't. Brett C. has 2 dogs, or Brett C. does not have 2 dogs. So knowing the truth value of a sentence allows us to make certain logical conclusions and inferences from its meaning. So based on those first 2 sentences, we can, if Brett C. is the instructor of this course, we know that Brett C. is an instructor. And if the instructor has 1 orange cat and 1 gray cat, we know that the instructor has 2 cats, at least. So now that we've taken these first steps into propositional logic, we can begin to discuss logical relations. So logical relations are the effects that the truth of one sentence has on the truth of other sentences. We'll cover 4 sentential relations today. These are logical entailment, logical equivalence, logical contradiction, and logical contrariety. Once we've done that, we'll expand down to the word level and talk about the relations, logical relations between words, in other words, lexical relations. So the first sentential relation we'll talk about is logical entailment. And so entailment is when the truth of one sentence requires another sentence to be true. It is a type of implication, so that if a sentence P is true, then a sentence Q must also be true, or a proposition P and proposition Q. And so we have seen just a couple of these. We just saw a couple of these, but I'll give you another one here. So Calgary is a Canadian city is our first sentence. Calgary is a city is our second sentence. In order to test whether we have logical entailment, we perform a contradiction test in which we conjoin the first sentence with the negation of the second sentence. So if you want to test that Calgary is a Canadian city entails that Calgary is a city, you have the sentence, Calgary is a Canadian city, but Calgary is not a city. If what you get is a contradiction, then sentence A, or sentence P, the blue one here, entails sentence Q, the red one here. So based on the contradiction that arises from Calgary is a Canadian city, but Calgary is not a city, we know that Calgary is a Canadian city entails that Calgary is at least a city. If we want to flip these, we could say that Seattle is a city is our first sentence, and then our second sentence is Seattle is a Canadian city. In order to test this, we have, for entailment, we have the contradiction test. We could say that Seattle is a city, but Seattle is not a Canadian city. This doesn't result in a contradiction or any obscurity of meaning, because Seattle is a city does not entail that Seattle is a Canadian city. In fact, it isn't. Seattle is a city, but Seattle is not a Canadian city. That's true. So that was logical entailment. We saw a couple examples of those. So now we'll move on to logical equivalence. So equivalence occurs when the truth of one sentence requires the truth of another sentence, and that the truth of that sentence requires the truth of the first sentence. So this can be described as being a case of mutual entailment, where P, if P is true, then Q must be true, and if Q is true, then P must also be true. So P has to entail Q, and Q has to entail P for them to be equivalent. Example of this, our first sentence, P, Justin Trudeau is Prime Minister of Canada. Then our second sentence, Justin Trudeau is the head of government of Canada. In order to test for equivalence, well, you just perform two contradiction tests, where you can join the first sentence to the second one or the negation of the second one with Justin Trudeau is the Prime Minister of Canada, but Justin Trudeau is not the head of government of Canada. Well, that doesn't make sense because the Prime Minister of Canada is the head of government of Canada. So already we know that they're not equivalent because P doesn't entail Q. If we want to carry out the second test, however, we could say Justin Trudeau is the head of government of Canada, but Justin Trudeau is not the Prime Minister of Canada. That also doesn't make sense because the head of government of Canada is the Prime Minister of Canada. The thing with equivalence, though, is you don't need to know the specific truth value of these sentences. If we travel in 40 years into the future and someone else is Prime Minister that's not Justin Trudeau, it doesn't matter if we could say these same things and they'd still not be equivalent. Or they'd still be equivalent, and therefore they'd still be equally true or equally false. Because Prime Minister is the head of government in Canada. In other words, these two sentences must share a truth value, whether that value is true or whether it's false. Whatever it is, it has to be the same for each of them. So the next sentential relation we'll talk about is logical contradiction. So contradiction occurs when two sentences always have opposite truth values. We saw a couple of these in testing entailment, so it's a bit weird how we've ordered things, but we'll move on. In order to stating this in logical terms, if sentence P is true, then sentence Q is false. And if sentence Q is true, then sentence P is false. No matter what these two sentences will always be contradictory, or they always have opposite truth values because they're contradictory. So pigeons are birds and pigeons are not birds. If pigeons are indeed birds, then it can't be the case that pigeons aren't birds. And if pigeons aren't birds, then it can't be the case that pigeons are birds. So that's because they're contradictions. So if once you know what these words mean, you know that they are, and you know the truth value of one, then you know the truth value of the other, based on the definitions of these words. So that one's a fairly simple one. If P is true, and Q, then Q is false. If Q is true, then P must be false. So the last sentential relation we'll talk about is logical contrariety. This is similar to contradiction, but only a one-way relationship. So if a sentence is true, then another sentence cannot also be true, but they can both be false. So it only maps their truth values when they're true. If they're false, one can be true and the other can be false. One can be false, the other can be true. But they can't both be true. Yeah. So if P is true, then Q cannot also be true. So an example of this would be with the proposition of Watson is more fluffy than Millie versus Millie is more fluffy than Watson. If Watson is more fluffy than Millie, then Millie cannot be more fluffy than Watson. However, both of these can be false. Watson and Millie, and we could say this by saying Watson and Millie are equally fluffy. Therefore, Watson is not more fluffy than Millie, and Millie is not more fluffy than Watson. And so this often occurs in natural language with adjectives which are able to be graded on a scale like this, when you can add something that's more or less fluffy, or more or less hard, harder, softer, good or better or worse. These are all pairs of scalar adjectives. They exist on scales, and not only are they pairs, they can be more or less of those things, and so those, you could have a scale of fluffiness or a scale of hardness, a scale of goodness, and we do have all of those things. So yeah, more or less fluffy, good, more good, better, bad, more bad, worse, bigger, smaller. All of these are scalar adjectives, and so these often come in pairs as well, just so you can refer downward and upward on the scale with different words. Speaking of different words, we'll be moving on to the logical relations between words. And so we don't need actual whole sentences to have logical relations. Indeed, words can have logical relations between them themselves. So the first one we'll talk about here is subordination, where one word is a member of a set represented by another word. So to give an example, dog is a member of the set of mammals. A dog is a type of mammal, therefore dog is subordinate to the class of things represented by mammals. Yeah. And so we don't need a whole sentence to talk about these things. We know as part of the meaning of mammal and dog that dog is a mammal, but not all mammals are dogs. Therefore, dog is subordinate to mammal. Moving on, we have equivalence. However, this is lexical equivalence, where one word or a small phrase has the same meaning as another word or phrase. So this can be shown through examples like a person and a human. A person is a human and a human is a person, so these two words are equivalent to each other. All humans are people, all people are humans, so they're equivalent. Anyone who's not a human is also not a person. Anyone who's not a person is also not a human. They're just completely equivalent terms. Moving on from there, we have complementarity, where the meanings of a set of words don't overlap and they exhaust all possibilities within that set. So animate and inanimate are complement of each other. Things are either animate or they're inanimate. Nothing is not. Nothing is not is something that's not one of them. So objects are either animate or inanimate. Nothing else. If they're not animate, then they're inanimate. If they're not inanimate, then they're animate. And that exhausts all the possibilities of the set of things in the world, in the universe. They're either animate or inanimate. I'm trying to think of other examples. I'm proposing this. You can make your own logic based on this, but would clothed and naked be similar to this in being complements to each other? Just like if you're not inanimate, then you're animate. If you're not naked, then are you clothed? And if you're not clothed, are you naked? I don't know. And these are the types of debates you can have in semantics. And then the last one on this slide having to do with lexical relations between words, logical relations between words, in other words, lexical relations, is incompatibility, where the meanings of a set of words don't overlap, but they don't exhaust all possibilities. So they're just like complements, they are members of the set of words and they don't overlap. However, they contrast from complements in that they don't exhaust all possibilities. There is something else that exists within these set of words. So drinks, like many classes of words and nouns, and members of those classes are incompatible with each other. You could have soda pop and you could have milk as types of drinks. However, you could have a drink that is not soda pop and not milk. Like you could have a juice. So soda pop, milk, and even if you add juice, you're not even exhaustive yet, because you could have something that's not those, and still, so all of these are incompatible with each other because they don't overlap, but they're not exhausting all of the possibilities of the class drinks. So moving on from there, it might have brought up in your mind concepts that are recalled some familiar terms from basically having to deal with language every day, and maybe in language arts courses. There are ways we can relate these to concepts in those classes and outside of this class. So the first of these are synonyms and antonyms, which we'll define here. So synonyms are words that have the same, or more often almost the same meaning. There are lots of pairs of these words that have almost the same meaning in English. So pretty and beautiful, big and large, cautious and careful, student and learner can all mean somewhat the same thing in some contexts, but not all contexts. Perfect synonyms are in fact pretty rare, just because we have infinite things to talk about. So why should we be finite with the way we talk about them, right? So perfect synonyms, if they ever exist, they only exist for so long. One member of that pair of synonyms drifts off and starts to add different meanings that the other pair doesn't. So you can imagine you could describe something as pretty but not being necessarily beautiful, or vice versa. In some contexts, a member of a synonym set might not be appropriate, and that's true of many synonym sets in the universe, or in English, and in many spoken and signed languages. You just have certain words that are more or less appropriate in a given context, and that is what we can use to distinguish synonyms. But often there are many cases where these words are perfectly equivalent, equally appropriate, and therefore synonyms. So as I said, even if you do have a perfect synonym, one member of that set will gain specialized uses that the other word doesn't. So they don't last for long, and it's arguable whether they even exist at all today in spoken language or in language because we've used language for so long. So related to this concept of synonyms, we have antonyms. So these are words which in some way have opposite meanings. So you have cases like soft and hard, hot and cold, teacher versus learner, lend versus borrow. Note that antonyms typically hold some part of their meaning as constant. So with soft and hard, you're talking about the hardness, for lack of a better word, of a surface. For hot and cold, you're talking about temperatures. For teachers and learners, you're talking about people who partake in the exchange of knowledge. And lend and borrow, you're talking about actions for temporary exchange, where you lend something to someone, and they're borrowing something from someone. So note that these terms may be either incompatible or, in fact, complementary, depending on just the type of opposition that they're existing within. Teacher and learner happen to be incompatible with each other if you're talking about types of people. You could be a teacher, you could be a learner, or you could be neither of those and still be a person. So they're incompatible. Yeah. So next we'll talk about ambiguity. And this refers to cases where a single word or a single phrase or a single sentence, so a single thing with a particular form having multiple different meanings. These meanings are therefore ambiguous. The structure, the form is ambiguous because it can be interpreted in more than one way. So ambiguity typically falls into, at the word level, typically falls into one of two categories: homonyms and polysemes. And the difference between them is whether or not the meanings the meanings within them are related or unrelated. So we'll break down homonymy here. So homonymy is a word. It occurs when a word has multiple meanings, but those meanings are unrelated. And this can be further broken down based on whether these words sound the same in the case of homophones. So we have the words lead and lead, which happen to be spelled differently in English. One is the past tense of a verb, the other is an element in our periodic table of elements. Very heavy, naturally occurring element. But as English has developed, it is only true that they are homophones. The way we write them, however, is different. Words can, however, be written the same, but sound differently. These are technically called homographs. So we have word like tear and tear. So on the bottom here we have a cat tearing up some paper towels, and at the top we have a teardrop. I guess a water droplet technically, but if this were coming from somebody's eyes, it'd be a teardrop. So in this case, we have homographs because they look like they're spelled. They are spelled the same. They're written the same, T-E-A-R. However, they happen to be pronounced differently, tear and tear. They have a different vowel sound. Or you could have something that is both homophonous and homographic. And these are true homonyms in this case, because they're spelled the same, and they happen to be sound the same. However, they don't have the same or related meanings. It's just a happenstance of how the language has developed. So you can think about the meanings of bank and bank. So the place where money is stored and exchanged versus the sides of a stream or a river. Bark and bark, the surface of a tree versus the noise that a dog makes is a bark. Both of those are bark. It's just a happenstance of English that they are spelled the same and are written the same. Rose versus rose. So a flower, rose, versus the past tense of rise, rose. And then tire versus tire. You have the noun tire, and what happens after a long day, you tire. And so all of these may lead to lexical ambiguity, which is ambiguity at the word level. And it's usually clarified by context. You can usually tell which meaning each of these refers to based on the meanings of the other words around it. The next type of lexical ambiguity arises due to polysemy. So polysemy refers to cases where a word has multiple meanings and those meanings are related. So there are lots and lots of cases of polysemy or polysemy in English and in many languages of the world. But here are examples of a few of them. Run versus run versus run. There's so many different meanings of the word run, and they all related to the concept of moving quickly, but refrigerators don't move quickly, do they? They just run. And so this has been a development of the verb to run, meaning just to have your internal parts moving in a way that functions. So run has gained that sense, that meaning of to function because of that. Because of the mechanical ways things run, move quickly, run has become very polysemous. Similarly, power versus power. So there's lots. You could have a noun that means power, and power in the verbal sense. However, they are related to the idea or the concept of internal energy. And similarly, you have cases elsewhere in the language with help, set, drink. I think the book gives set as an example of a dictionary entry that goes on and on just because there's so many different cases and meanings of the word set. And these all are typically related in that you're just adding different offshoots of meaning to the lexical item of set. I always thought run was this way, but it might be true that set has a longer dictionary entry than run. I don't know. I haven't looked at the dictionary in a bit. And drink. So anything that has a noun and a verb that have related meanings is going to be polysemous based on that, because verbs and nouns are different meanings. And so because of that, polysemy is often a result of conversion or zero derivation, which we talked about in morphology, where you don't add any morphemes to get a different lexical category. You just make it so. And so that has occurred with drink and set and run and power and help. So all of these are examples of polysemes that came about because of zero derivation. You're not adding anything, you're just changing the lexical category. So based on that, I'm sure you can think of some more homonyms or polysemes that come to mind. And now you have ways to categorize different polysemes or homophones or homographs or homonyms based on whether they're related meanings and based on whether they're written or sound the same. But that is just about all we'll talk about in terms of lexical relations, because now we're going to be relating meaning or adding an analysis of meaning to what we already looked at with our syntactic analysis in the previous two lectures. Specifically, we'll be getting into the different relations that noun phrases can have with verbs, both with inside them and inside the TP that they sit within together. So previously we examined the different types of complements that specific heads can take, and we saw that verbs can indeed take all sorts of complements. However, as I want to do in this class is just we can break this down even further. We can divide those complement types by the meaning that they share or that they give to the verb. And it's specifically and particularly true among the noun phrases that are associated with within these verb phrases. So this has to do with the verb's object, the verb's subject, or a noun phrase within a prepositional phrase that has to do with the verb itself as well. So, I mean, just thinking about these, there's various ways an object and a subject can play different roles in the action of that is denoted by that verb. And so we can call these different roles thematic roles, because one of these roles happens to be what we'll call a theme, and so that kind of gives its meaning to the whole set, thematic roles. There are quite a few, but for our case, when we're analyzing English and discussing English, we'll just be talking about 7 of these thematic roles. And so there are 7, and we don't really mark them in English, but the specific roles that a verb gives and can be associated with does vary from verb to verb. And so that's part of the meaning of the verb, is what types of thematic roles it has. So without breaking it down any further than that, we'll just jump down into it. So the first thematic role we'll talk about is the agent role. And so this is the entity that intentionally does an action. And so this action denoted by a verb, anything that does that action is the agent of that verb. And we kind of referenced this in our morphology, again, our morphology chapter, when we talked about agentive nouns. That's a different kind of thing that has to do with this, in that you add a suffix to a verb to talk about the agent of this. So you're talking about the role played by this entity, and you could give them this noun label as well. So that's what this agent is the person, the thing that does an action. Therefore, we can say that the verb assigns the agent role to a noun phrase. In English, this is usually the subject of a sentence. It doesn't have to be. This is something we can manipulate by turning an active sentence into a passive one, is that you're demoting the agent usually, or you're demoting the agent from subject to object. And so instead of the verb having an agent which is a subject, you have a verb which the agent is the object. So examples of this, first we have the dog eats the trash. Who is doing the eating? What is doing the eating? The dog. So the dog is the agent of eat. Another example, a farmer plants the corn. Who or what is doing the planting? A farmer is, so they are the agent. And then the class was taught by the instructor. Taught, who or what is doing the teaching? It's not the subject, the class is being taught. Therefore, the instructor is the agent. The instructor is teaching the class was taught by the instructor. So this is one way English can manipulate where agents appear, is usually agents are subjects. However, by making them passive, in passive sentences, the object will be an agent. And so if we were to look at how we were to analyze these, so here is the tree structure for a farmer plants the corn. What is happening here when the verb is assigning the thematic role of agent, it's looking up there to the specifier of TP and assigning the agent role. So this assignment of theta roles, or thematic roles rather, theta role is another word for thematic role, confusingly enough, that are equivalent, is that this assignment of thematic roles is occurring at the deep structure before anything moves around. Once things start moving around, it gets a bit more difficult to assign them roles. So it doesn't. It only assigns the roles at the deep structure. At the surface level, roles are already assigned, so it doesn't matter if they're farther away. So you can imagine that who plants the corn, if that WH word who moves up, it doesn't matter that it's all the way at the top of the CP at this point, because it received its thematic role when it was the subject of the sentence at the specifier of TP position. So moving on, usually discussed as kind of the counterpart of the agent is the theme or patient. So this theme or patient, it usually what we call it, whether it's a theme or a patient, usually depends on the level of animacy of that, but for our purposes they're exactly the same thing. So this theme / patient is the entity which is affected by an action. So instead of intentionally doing an action, they're the ones receiving the effects of that action. And so when that action is denoted by a verb, it's this verb which assigns the theme role to the noun phrase, which is denoted by that entity, which denotes that entity. And so these are usually the direct objects of English sentences. However, they can be subjects as well. We saw them in the case of passives. So, for example, the child kicked the ball. Who's kicking the ball? Well, the child, and so they're the agent. What is the child kicking? The ball. Therefore, the ball receives the theme thematic role from kicked. Another example, the cat finds the catnip. You could ask those same questions. Who is doing the finding? The cat. So they're the agent. What is the cat finding? The catnip. Therefore, the catnip is the direct object and the theme of find. And if we want an example of a passive, the book was read by a student. Who's doing the reading? The student. So they're the agent. And then, so what is the student reading? The book. The book is getting read. Therefore, it is the theme of reading. If you were to diagram this, you'd have a similar sentence structure, which we just saw, with the subject in the specifier TP, a minus past, the verb head finds, and then its object, the corn, the complement of the verb phrase. And so if we were to label the assignment of thematic roles, well, first we would have said that finds assigns agent to the cat, but then it assigns theme to the corn as its complement direct object. And so that's something that the verb find does. It assigns both a thematic role for an agent and a thematic role for a theme. Who's doing the finding and what they are finding. So the next thematic role we'll talk about is breaking a bit from the structure given by sentence, in that it can appear in various parts of the sentence in relation to the verb. So this is the thematic role of experiencer. So this is the entity that experiences a change of psychological state. That kind of implies that it is in fact an animate entity. May be, it might not be. But that's how we define it, is that this is the entity which experiences a change of psychological state. And that change of state is typically denoted by a verb. So that verb assigns the experiencer thematic role to a noun phrase. And so this experiencer can be the subject or can be an object in English. For example, the neighbor heard the crash. Who's doing the hearing? Well, they're not intentionally hearing, but what they did happen to do is hear. And so the neighbor experiences the sound of the crash. It's a change of psychological state. First you weren't hearing and now you're hearing. So the neighbor is the experiencer of hearing. And it happens to be, in that case, the subject. Down here, with the cat surprised their human, in this case, the human is experiencing a change in being unsurprised to being surprised. Therefore, the human, their human, is the experiencer of that verb surprise. And depending on it, the actual intentions of surprise or here, the other thematic role that the verb assigns can be different. It can be agent, can be theme, it might even be a source, which we'll talk about in a bit. So it depends on really the context of the verb and what's happening in terms of the other thematic role that these verbs assign. But no matter what the actual context is, the way it does it is the same. So the verb is assigning an experiencer role to a noun phrase. And so we said for the neighbor heard the crash, the neighbor was the experiencer. So we'll draw an arrow from heard up to the noun phrase in the subject position to the neighbor and label that with experiencer. And so the heard is assigning experiencer to the neighbor. Moving on from that, we have the stimulus. So this is often paired with the experiencer role in that the stimulus is the entity denoted by a noun phrase, which is the trigger of a change of psychological state, which is denoted by a verb. Therefore, the verb assigns the stimulus thematic role to that noun phrase, which is undergoing that change of psychological state. Again, this can be either a subject or an object in English, and I'll give you a couple of examples here. So first we have the ghost spooked my parents. And if the ghost isn't intentionally doing this and they're just existing, and that's the thing that causes a change in psychological state, the perception of their existence, then the ghost is in fact a stimulus and is the subject of the verb. So the subject of the verb no matter what, but in this case it would be the stimulus by having that kind of just being the cause of the change of psychological state kind of passively, despite being the subject. So that's just the confusion and ambiguity we have with the term passive. It refers to a type of structure, but it also refers to a type of meaning in that ghosts can spook things passively, in which case you can describe it with a passive structure. My parents were spooked by the ghost. And you might want to do that given that context, and that's why we have the passive structure. But here we have the active structure, which can still refer to that case where the ghost passively spooks my parents. Or you could have the stimulus as the object of a verb. And so the farmer heard the crow of the rooster. Here, the farmer hears something. What are they hearing? What is causing the change of psychological state that says, hey, I heard something, I guess, that whatever goes on in terms of the neurology and the psychology but between the crow of the rooster and the farmer, whatever it is, the crow of the rooster is the stimulus, the thing that's causing that psychological state to change from I didn't hear a rooster to I did hear a rooster. And similarly, to every thematic role we've talked about is that the verb is assigning the stimulus to the noun phrase. And so in the first sentence, the ghost is the subject, but it is also the stimulus because the spooked is looking to assign the stimulus role to a noun phrase. And so it does that to the subject, the ghost. Whereas the experiencer of the spooking was my parents, the object in this case. So yeah, stimulus. The next thematic role is a bit different from those, and it is the entity, the benefactive or the beneficiary is the entity that benefits from an action. So we briefly hinted at this with ditransitive verbs, but many indirect objects of ditransitive verbs are beneficiaries. They're receiving good from the action, but they're not actually being directly affected by that action. And so the noun phrase, which denotes the entity which benefits from an action denoted by a verb, is receiving the beneficiary thematic role from that verb. So this noun phrase may be inside a prepositional phrase, or it can be just a noun phrase directly inside that complement, as a complement to that verb. So usually this is an indirect object in English. And indirect objects typically mean they're inside prepositional phrases rather than inside the verb phrase directly itself. So someone bought him a horse. Who's doing the buying? Well, someone. That's the subject. What did they buy? A horse. Well, who did they buy the horse for? Him. Me. Him. So they benefited from the action of someone buying a horse because instead of them having to buy a horse, someone else bought it for them. They didn't have to spend anything. Someone else spent the money for them. Therefore, they benefit from this action of buying. Therefore, they're the beneficiary of bought. But we said this can also appear inside a prepositional phrase, inside the verb phrase. So I baked a cake for y'all. Who's doing the baking? I am. What did I bake? A cake. Who did I bake the cake for? Y'all. Therefore, y'all is the beneficiary. Y'all are the beneficiary of the verb baked. Trying to think of a case with the beneficiary as the subject. You baked the cake by me. Yeah, I guess. He was bought a horse by someone. Yeah, it's a bit fishy, but I think it works. I don't know. You tell me. If you're an expert in English, and if you're a speaker of English, you are an expert in English, you'll have some sort of judgment on whether or not these subject beneficiaries exist, and I think they do. But the structure of these object beneficiaries is relatively the same in that because these are ditransitive verbs, they allow for multiple complements, and so the ditransitive verb is assigning an agent, it's assigning a theme, and then it's also assigning an optional beneficiary. In this case, someone is the agent, him is the beneficiary, and a horse is the theme. And so we would denote that similarly with arrows and label those arrows, in this case, the beneficiary arrow between bought and him. So that is beneficiary or benefactive. I almost always call it beneficiary because benefactive doesn't sound like a noun to me, even though it is. But moving on from that, we have our last couple, I think. The first of these is goal. So you can imagine what a goal is, but the goal is the entity towards which an action is directed, or which is the endpoint of a movement. And whether that movement or action is either of those will be denoted by a verb. So that verb will be assigning the goal thematic role to the noun phrase, which denotes that entity. Just like with the last one, the noun phrase may indeed be inside of a prepositional phrase rather than as a direct complement to the verb. So because of that, they're usually an indirect object in English. Or maybe even something you don't even consider an object. You just call it the goal. And so, as I said, it's the endpoint of movement. So go verbs are your prototypical movement verbs. So we went to the moon. Who's doing the going? Well, we are. Where are we going to? The moon. So the moon is the goal of that going. So it receives the goal thematic role from went. And so if we were to put that in our structure, the P is flying off into the abyss, but what matters here is the relationship between that verb and that noun phrase. And so we'll draw that arrow from went to the noun phrase the moon. And so the moon is receiving that thematic role of goal from went. This is paired with the thematic role of source. So source is the entity from which an action originates, or which is the starting point of a movement. So just like we saw with this one of goal, it's the entity which is the entity towards which an action is directed, or which is the end point of a movement. The source is the opposite of that. So we saw this with our antonyms. These are typically antonyms in the relation to the verb. And so the action that is originating and the movement will be denoted by a verb, and it is this verb which assigns the source thematic role to the entity which undergoes, or which is the starting point, or which is where the action is originating. And again, these noun phrases may be inside of a prepositional phrase, and is therefore usually the indirect objects in English. Anytime, yeah. So yeah, you have for example, we come from France. Coming is a movement verb, which typically assigns a source, whereas going assigns that goal. You go to somewhere, you come from somewhere. You can go from somewhere, and you can come to somewhere, but typically that's a bit of a weird context. It does exist, and these verbs can adapt, but typically in the kind of uncontextualized sense, coming typically has an unmarked or a default of assigning the source thematic role. And so we come from France is a perfectly acceptable sentence. We are doing the ones that are moving. We are the ones that are moving. And where are we moving from? France. So come assigns the thematic role of source to France. So this structure would look identical to what we just saw. We is the subject, so it receives, and it's doing the coming, so it receives the thematic role of agent, whereas France is the starting point of this movement, so it receives the thematic role of source from come. And so this leads us to, I think, the last definition we'll talk about today, and that is the Theta Criterion. And so when a noun phrase is assigned a thematic role, it becomes an argument of that verb phrase. And so we could talk about verb phrases having multiple arguments or a single argument. Intransitive verbs have single argument. Transitive verbs have 2 arguments. Ditransitive verbs have 3 arguments. So that's a definition of argument. And this will allow us to define our Theta Criterion. And so these are, it's a singular Theta Criterion, but there's 2 sentences. So I'll just leave them here. So the first of these Theta Criteria are that each thematic role is assigned to exactly 1 argument. So you can't double up on who is the theme, who is the agent. If you have multiple things, it's probably because they are conjoined with a conjunction, and it's that bigger conjunction that is receiving the thematic role rather than each of the conjoinees individually. So the second of our Theta criteria is that each argument is assigned exactly 1 thematic role. And so a verb cannot be both the theme and the agent, or a noun phrase cannot be both the theme and an agent. It is only going to get one of those. If it does happen to get both in kind of the meaning of it, it will typically have another word to take that thematic role rather than the same word taking the 2 different thematic roles. But what the Theta Criterion don't say is how many thematic roles can each verb assign. Some can assign 1, some can assign 2, and some can assign 3. And this goes into part of what we talked about with the transitivity of a verb. Intransitive verbs assign 1 thematic role to its subject, but it doesn't say which, and that depends on the actual meaning of the verb. Which of the thematic roles. So these are just questions you're going to have to ask of each verb that comes up in our analysis. What are the actors, the arguments doing in relation to this verb? But you might be wondering why theta, and I hinted at it earlier with my slip up. Theta, why not? Well, why not theta? But no, thematic roles are also called theta roles in some theories of syntax and semantics. And it's just because the th in thematic can be written as theta. And so the Greek letter theta, which we could spell with instead theta rather than the actual letters theta, eta. I don't know how to spell it in Greek. But yeah, so thematic roles and theta roles are essentially the same thing, just depending on your theory of syntax. But the last slide I'll leave you with in today's lecture, it has to do with tests on how to determine particular thematic roles for verbs. And so we saw our 7 thematic roles. Basically the easiest way to determine a specific thematic role is to ask the specific question for each of those roles. So for agent, you can ask the yes/no question to yourself. Is someone or something doing this? Who is that person? Who is that thing? What is that thing? So if the answer is yes, then you could ask that question of who is doing this? And the answer to that question would be your agent. For theme, you could similarly ask the yes/no question. Is this being done to someone or something? If so, whom? And then that object, of the answer to that question would be the theme. For experiencer, you can ask, is someone or something feeling something? If so, who is doing that feeling? Or are they going through a change of state? If so, who is going through that change of state? They are the experiencer. Stimulus, you could ask, is someone or something causing a feeling? Or are they triggering a change of state? If they are causing a feeling, or if they are triggering a change of state, who are they? They are the stimulus. Beneficiary, so the beneficiary, you could ask, is someone benefiting from this action? They're not being changed by the action, but they are indeed benefiting it. And if so, or they're receiving something from this action, if the answer is yes, you can ask who is benefiting from this action or who is receiving something from this action. The answer to those questions will be the beneficiary of that action denoted by that verb. And then we have goal, where they're talking about movement. So you could ask the questions, where is something or something moving towards, or where is someone or something moving from? Depending on the question, you have the goal or the source is the answer to those questions. You might have a leading in question, is someone or something moving towards something? Or is someone or something moving from someone or something? Then you can ask these questions if the answer to that is indeed yes. If the answer is no, then you probably don't have a goal or a source. And similarly, for all of these questions, if the initial question is answered by no, then you probably don't have an agent or a theme or experiencer or a stimulus or a beneficiary or a goal or a source, depending on the actual question. But the main idea here is you can ask any of these questions to arrive at an answer as to which of the thematic roles to assign each noun phrase related to that verb. But that just about does it for our first week of semantics. So I'll leave with the announcements. On Thursday, your 5th discussion post will be due. It'll be your last one, so be sure to get that in. And then on Friday, you can start working on the last quiz, semantics and pragmatics. I'm currently working on the final assignment, or the second assignment, which has to do with syntax and semantics. So if you're looking for that, that should be out within the next week or so. But what will be happening next week is our lecture on semantics and pragmatics. And so that'll be covering the readings from chapter 6, sections 4 through 5. But other than that, that is all I have for you today. So thank you for watching. I hope you will come back in the future. Other than that, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and you'll hear me next time.